Theodore Wynne was 44 years old, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades understanding one fundamental truth about himself. He was the kind of man who stayed. Not because he lacked options, not because fear kept him rooted, but because he believed, in the way that quiet men believe in things they have tested against real pressure, that commitment was not a feeling. It was a choice you made again every single morning, especially on the mornings when nothing about it felt worth making. On a Thursday evening in late September, his wife of 11 years told him he was no longer necessary. She did not use those words exactly. She used words that were polished and rehearsed and designed to sound like empowerment, but what she meant was, "I have $38 million now, and you are a liability I no longer wish to carry." What Felicia Wynne did not understand, could not have understood, because she had been too busy redesigning her future to examine the legal architecture of her present, was that the $38 million she believed she had inherited free and clear was not hers to spend. It was not hers to touch. The patents, the royalties, the licensing agreements, the commercial real estate holdings wrapped inside her late father's estate. All of it had been legally restructured, at her father's quiet and deliberate instruction, into a structure that Theodore alone had the authority to release. She had just kicked out the only man holding the combination to the vault she thought she had already opened. If you have ever poured yourself into something, a marriage, a family, a business, and watched the person you gave it to look through you like you were furniture, stay with me. This one is going to mean something to you. Houston, Texas, late September. The kind of evening that arrives warm and leaves you without warning, the way certain decisions do. Theodore had been in Beaumont that day, overseeing a substation installation for a mid-size energy firm he had been consulting for the past 3 years. It was physical work at its edges, steel frames, conduit runs, the particular patience required when you are the person responsible for making sure that nothing goes wrong before the crew goes home. He drove back on I-10 with the windows down because the AC on his truck had been running weak since July, and he had not yet found a Saturday free enough to take it in. Country station on low, a gas station coffee in the cup holder that had been hot approximately 40 miles ago. He was thinking about the ceiling fan in the guest bathroom that had been clicking for 2 weeks and wondering if he could fix it Sunday morning before the afternoon got away from him. He pulled into the driveway of their home in Bel Air and sat for a moment before he understood what he was looking at. 3 boxes, stacked neatly beside the front door, taped shut. His name written on the side in Felicia's handwriting, the wide, looping cursive she used when she wanted to appear organized rather than feel organized. A 4th box had tipped slightly and a framed photograph had slid halfway out. Him and his father at a fishing lake in East Texas, 1997. His father was laughing at something off camera. Theodore was 14 and squinting into the sun. He got out of the truck. He walked to the boxes. He righted the tipped one and pressed the photograph back inside with care. The front door opened. Felicia Wynne stood in the frame in a silk blouse he had never seen before, the price tag removed but the crease of newness still visible at the shoulders. Her hair was blown straight, her jewelry was different, a bracelet he did not recognize, and her expression was the one that Theodore associated. In the particular psychological shorthand you develop after 11 years with someone, with a decision that had already been fully made before the conversation began. She said his name, the way you say the name of a chapter you have already finished. Theodore, I think we both know this has been coming for a while. He said nothing. He had learned, across many years in rooms where other people were louder than him, that silence was not weakness. It was information gathering. I've been thinking about where I want my life to go. She gestured behind her at the house, at what she seemed to believe was now entirely hers. With the estate settled, I have real options now, real freedom. And honestly, this marriage, she paused with the timing of someone who had rehearsed this, has been holding me back from who I'm becoming." Theodore looked at her steadily. He had a particular quality of stillness, the kind that some people mistook for passivity, and that was, in fact, one of the most disciplined things about him. "You sure this is what you want, Felicia?" he said. His voice was level. "There's no version of this that goes back." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. "I'm sure," she said. "I'll have the divorce papers to your attorney by Monday. You can keep the truck." The door closed. Theodore stood in the driveway in the early dark. Cicadas in the live oaks along the property line. A dog barking somewhere 2 houses down. The smell of someone's dinner coming through a screen window. He reached into his jacket pocket, his father's old Zippo lighter. Not because he smoked, he hadn't in 15 years, but because his father had carried it every day of his adult life, and the weight of it in Theodore's hand felt like something continuous and steady in a world that was currently doing neither. He turned it over twice. The metal was warm from his body heat. He slipped it back into his pocket. Then he allowed himself one small, private expression that no one who saw it would have easily decoded. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something closer to the feeling a structural engineer gets when a load-bearing calculation he ran 18 months ago proves out exactly as predicted. Because Felicia had just announced herself the owner of $38 million. And she had done it without once reading the trust documents her father had spent the last year of his life restructuring, without once asking what the IP licensing agreements actually said, without once wondering why her father had asked to speak with Theodore alone on 3 separate occasions in the final 8 months of his illness. She had opened a door she believed led to freedom, and she had not noticed that the man she'd just expelled from her life was the only one who knew what was actually on the other side of it. "Stay with me, because in a moment we're going back 9 years to the afternoon." Theodore sat at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and decided to save a company that didn't have his name on it. Yet, before we go there, if your partner came into serious money overnight and told you the marriage was the thing holding them back, would you walk away quietly or push back? Drop it in the comments. 2 words is enough. 9 years earlier, Arthur Pemberton's technology firm was drowning. Pemberton Systems had started as a 2-man patent licensing operation out of a Greenway Plaza office suite in the early 2000s. Arthur was an engineer by training, the kind of man who understood exactly how things worked and had somewhat less patience for the human variables that surrounded the things. He had built a portfolio of 12 patents in industrial sensor technology over 20 years and had, for a long time, made a quiet and respectable living licensing them to mid-size manufacturing companies across the Gulf Coast. Then a larger competitor had initiated an aggressive licensing dispute. The legal costs had been compounding for 16 months. Arthur's primary licensing partner had gone quiet while the litigation was pending. 2 of his best engineers had left for stability. The operating account was down to a balance that Arthur described to Theodore in a low voice over coffee at his kitchen table as embarrassing. Theodore had been married to Felicia for 2 years by then. He was 35. He had a consulting business of his own, modest and solid, built on a reputation for solving problems that other engineers found too complicated to be worth the time. He did not make speeches about what he was about to do. He simply picked up the yellow legal pad from the kitchen counter, sat down, and started working through the math. He restructured the litigation strategy personally, not through attorneys, though attorneys were eventually involved, but first through Theodore, who had spent a weekend studying patent law case precedents with the focused intensity that his college professors had called alarming, and his father had called a gift. He identified a licensing model that the competitor had not accounted for. He renegotiated the primary partnership agreement directly. Sitting across from 3 corporate attorneys in a conference room who had walked in, expecting to minimize and walked out having granted terms that Arthur's own counsel had not thought achievable. Within 14 months, Pemberton Systems was not only solvent, it was expanding. Arthur Pemberton shook his son-in-law's hand in the driveway of his Tanglewood home on a Sunday afternoon. The old man's grip was firmer than Theodore expected from someone who had recently looked so worn. "You didn't have to do that," Arthur said. "Yes, sir," Theodore said. "I did." At church the following Sunday, Felicia had leaned against his shoulder during the sermon and whispered that she was proud of him. That was 9 years ago. Arthur was diagnosed with a progressive cardiac condition not long after the company stabilized. He was a methodical man, careful with information, and he kept the prognosis closer than he kept most things. He managed it for several years with characteristic discipline, but in the final 18 months, the situation narrowed, and Arthur began doing what careful men do when they understand that time is finite. He started organizing. He had been watching his daughter for a long time by then. A father's love does not prevent observation. In some cases, it sharpens it, because the stakes of what you see are higher. He had noticed the changes in Felicia over the preceding 2 years. The way her attention had shifted from the business and the family to questions about accounts, valuations, asset distributions. He had been introduced to a man named Philip Moss, who attended 2 of Arthur's charity dinners and spent a notable portion of both evenings talking to Felicia in ways that had less to do with conversation and more to do with calculation. Arthur had asked a few quiet questions and had not liked the answers he found. He had also watched his son-in-law show up, at the office, at the hospital, at the house on a Tuesday morning with groceries and a willingness to sit in silence when silence was what was needed. He had watched Theodore do the invisible work that does not make it onto balance sheets or anniversary cards, and he had made a decision: Theodore. The old man's voice, when he asked for the private conversation, was thin but entirely clear. He was sitting up in the hospital room with the particular dignity of a man refusing to let the setting diminish him. He waited until the door was fully closed. "I've spent the last 8 months restructuring the estate with my attorneys. Every asset, the patents, the royalties, the real estate holdings, all of it, has been moved into an irrevocable trust. The trust carries a matching debt obligation built into its structure. You are the sole beneficiary of the trust." He met Theodore's eyes without looking away. "And the primary creditor. You're the only one who can authorize the release of those assets." Theodore was quiet for a moment. He's processing not the legal mechanics. He had, in fact, recognized the structure the moment Arthur began describing it. "But something older and heavier. She is your daughter," he said. "She is," Arthur said, "and I love her. But love is not the same as blindness, and I am not a blind man. I am asking you to protect what I built, not as a punishment to her, as a preservation of something I spent my life creating." He put his hand on Theodore's forearm. "Do not show your hand. Let things unfold. When she makes the choice I believe she will make, because I know my child, Theodore, and I know what that man is putting in her ear, step in. Do it cleanly. Do it with documentation, and do it without cruelty." Theodore held the old man's gaze for a long moment. "Yes, sir," he said. "I hear you." Arthur died 6 weeks later. The service was held at Antioch Missionary Baptist Church in the 3rd Ward, where he had been a deacon for 22 years. The mayor's office sent a representative. Former colleagues came from 3 states. 3 months after the funeral, Theodore's college friend Ray called him on a Saturday afternoon. Ray was not a man who called without reason. He had been at a rooftop event downtown and had seen Felicia arrive with Philip Moss in a way that was not ambiguous about the nature of their relationship. Ray had taken one photograph purely from instinct and had sent it before he fully decided whether to. He said on the phone, "Brother, I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to tell you." Theodore was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Katy. He had been about to go in for weather stripping. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he texted back, "I know. I'm handling it." That evening he called Constance Webb. Constance Webb ran a forensic accounting and legal consulting practice out of a building on Westheimer Road. She wore her hair natural, kept her desk completely clear, and had the reputation, carefully earned over 20 years, of being the most organized person in any room she entered. She spoke slowly and said exactly what she meant, which was rarer than it should have been in her industry. Theodore had worked with her briefly during the original Pemberton restructuring. She had been the one who caught a discrepancy in the licensing revenue model that Theodore had missed, and she had pointed it out without making him feel small, which had told him something important about her. He told her everything that evening: the trust structure, the debt obligation, Arthur's instructions, the photograph from Ray. She listened without interrupting. She made 4 notes on a yellow legal pad. Then she said, "How long do you want to give this?" "Long enough for the record to build itself," Theodore said. She looked at her calendar. 12 months minimum, she said. It wasn't a suggestion. 12 months, he agreed. What followed was a parallel operation conducted with the patience and precision of 2 people who understood that the most powerful documentation is the kind that assembles itself from facts rather than arguments. Constance ran a full forensic audit of Pemberton Systems' financials going back 30 months. Theodore handled the legal transfer of lien positions and the careful restructuring of his own relationship to the trust, all of it documented and notarized by independent counsel. He arranged through the trust the quiet acquisition of the outstanding mortgage on their Bel Air home, filed correctly, recorded properly, transferred without Theodore, and through all of it, Theodore came home on evenings when Felicia was there. He cooked on Sundays. He fixed the downstairs bathroom faucet. He kept his consulting work steady and his demeanor unchanged. Some evenings Felicia came home at 10 or 11, and Theodore would be at the kitchen table with project files and a glass of water, and he would look up and say, "Long day?" She would say, "Mm-hmm," and walk past him, and he would sit in the quiet of the house and think about the difference between waiting and preparing, and about how from a certain distance those 2 things could look identical. Felicia told her sister she intended to end the marriage. Theodore sent Constance 1 text message: "Prepare the documents." What Felicia organized in that Galleria area hotel ballroom to publicly reintroduce herself to Houston was something carefully designed to land with maximum impact. What she did not design for was the person she had decided was too quiet to be a threat. Felicia called it a new chapter. She had invitations printed on cream stock and distributed to 200 guests. Houston's established professional class, several old colleagues of Arthur's, the kind of people who had known her since she was a girl at her father's side at church and business functions. She hired a florist, a photographer, and a jazz quartet. She rented the main event room at the St. Regis Houston for a Saturday evening in October. She wore a rose gold gown and her grandmother's pearls, which she had taken from Arthur's safe the week after the funeral. Philip Moss stood at her side at the entrance and greeted guests with a warmth that had been professionally calibrated over many years of socially advantageous evenings. Felicia had her assistant contact Theodore that morning. The message was factual and brief. "Felicia would like you present this evening. The divorce documents will be ready for signature at 9 o'clock, not in an attorney's office, in a ballroom." In front of everyone who had watched Arthur Pemberton build his legacy and hand it, presumably, to his daughter. She wanted witnesses. When her assistant confirmed Theodore had agreed to attend, Felicia said, "Let him have a graceful exit. That's more than he's earned." Theodore spent that Saturday morning at his mother's house in Missouri City. Dorothy Wynne was 68 years old and possessed the gift that certain women develop across decades of watching people closely. She could read a room from a photograph and read her son from a single exhaled breath. She made cornbread in the cast-iron skillet that had been on her stovetop since Theodore was in middle school. He sat at the table where he had done his homework, where he had told her about his first job, where he had sat on a Sunday morning 11 years ago and told her he was going to propose to Felicia. And his mother had said, "She's lovely, baby." Just make sure she knows what she has. They had not spoken about that conversation since. You nervous? Dorothy asked, her back to him, working the skillet. No, ma'am. She turned. She had the reading look, the one that took years to develop and could not be learned from anything except time and love and paying attention. You sad? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, Mama, he said. That's the right word for it. She set down the dish towel. She walked to where he was sitting and put both hands on the sides of his face, the way she had when he was small, and trying to hold something together that was too heavy for a child to hold. Your father would be proud of you, she said. Arthur would be proud of you. Theodore covered one of her hands with his. He held it there for a moment without speaking. He left her house at 6:30. At 8:15, a dark navy Escalade arranged through the trust pulled up in front of the St. Regis. Theodore stepped out in a charcoal suit, no tie, collar open by one button. He moved the way he always moved, with the unhurried, observant pace of a man who is not performing anything for anyone. Constance Webb fell into step beside him, leather briefcase in hand, expression neutral in the way that a loaded legal argument is neutral. They went inside. The ballroom was warm and full. The jazz quartet was playing something understated and elegant. The room recognized Theodore's arrival the way rooms do when someone enters who belongs there and knows it. Conversations paused, heads turned, and in the faces of the older guests, the ones who had known Arthur Pemberton for 30 years and had watched Theodore sit at his hospital bedside, something shifted. Felicia saw him from across the room. Her smile held, but only because she was good at holding smiles. She crossed toward him. Philip a half step behind. You came, she said lightly. I wasn't sure you would. You asked me to, Theodore said. She gestured at a table near the center of the room where a document envelope rested against a floral arrangement. This should take 10 minutes, she said. It's straightforward. Before we get there, Theodore said, his voice carrying only to their small circle. I want to ask you one question. The room around them had grown quieter in the way rooms do when something with real weight is about to happen. You've told these people you've inherited $38 million, he said. Felicia lifted her chin. I have. Do you understand what that $38 million actually is? She gave a short, bright laugh that did not reach her eyes. It's my father's estate, she said. He left it to me. Theodore held her gaze for one additional second. Then he nodded at Constance. Constance Webb did not hurry. She set the briefcase on the edge of the nearest banquet table, opened it with deliberate calm, and began placing documents in a clean row on the white linen. Pemberton Systems and the associated estate assets, totaling approximately $38 million, were restructured 14 months ago into a private irrevocable trust. The trust was designed with a matching debt obligation, $38 million built into its legal foundation. Every asset in the estate is secured against that debt. She paused the way a surgeon pauses, not for drama, but for precision. Theodore Wynne is the sole beneficiary of the trust. He is also the primary and only creditor. He alone holds the legal authority to release those assets. The room went still. Someone near the back set down their glass slowly, like sudden movement might shatter something. Felicia's hand tightened on her champagne flute, just slightly, just enough. She looked at the documents and then at Theodore. That's not possible. Page 3, Constance said evenly, is the trust certification, filed 14 months ago and notarized by 4 independent attorneys. Page 7 is the creditor assignment. She moved to the second set of documents. This is a separate matter. She placed a bound audit report on the table. Clean cover, Pemberton Systems letterhead. Over the past 14 months, approximately $2.2 million was transferred from Pemberton Systems operating accounts into 2 private accounts. One registered to Felicia Wynne, one registered to Philip Moss. This is fully documented through bank wire records, internal accounting logs, and signed authorization forms, including several signed under a power of attorney that was not legally in effect at the time of use. The room did not shout. These were not people who shouted, but the sound of 200 people processing something simultaneously. The intake of breath, the rapid low murmur, the careful setting down of glasses was its own kind of thunder. The older guests, the ones who had known Arthur Pemberton since before Felicia was born, the ones who had sat beside him at deacon meetings and watched him build his company with the patient precision of a man who understood that integrity was not a marketing strategy, but a practice. Those guests did not murmur. They looked at Philip Moss and then at Felicia, and their expressions carried the particular weight of a community's judgment, which is heavier and more durable than any court's. Philip Moss had taken on the appearance of a man calculating distances to exits. Felicia forced a short sound that was supposed to be laughter and wasn't quite. "You arranged this," she said. "You manufactured this." Theodore's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Your father loved you," he said, "but he knew you, and he built accordingly." Hold on, because what Theodore produced from the inside pocket of his jacket next is the thing this entire story was building toward from its first sentence. Constance continued. She did not pause for effect. "There is one additional matter." She set a third document on the table. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, Mr. Wynne, acting through the trust, completed the legal acquisition of the outstanding mortgage on the Belair property currently registered in Felicia Wynne's name. The acquisition was finalized using trust funds that have been in authorized escrow for the past 90 days. As of 2 o'clock today, that property belongs entirely to Theodore Wynne. A woman near the front of the room said quietly, "Lord." The house where Felicia had stacked his boxes outside the front door, where she had told him, in a silk blouse with the crease of newness still in it, that he was holding her back from who she was becoming. He had owned it since the middle of the afternoon. He had owned it while she was at the salon. Felicia looked at the document on the table. Her expression moved through disbelief, and then calculation, and then down to something beneath both of those. Something unguarded and real that she had no practiced response for. The vertiginous understanding that the ground you were certain of has not existed for a very long time. She looked at Theodore. He was already reaching into his jacket. What he removed was not a document. It was a letter, a single page, folded 3 times, the paper soft at the creases from having been handled across 14 months. The handwriting on the front was Arthur Pemberton's, deliberate, the slightly old-fashioned print of an engineer who believed that how you wrote reflected how you thought. On the outside, in Arthur's hand, for the man who showed up, several guests in that room had received notes from Arthur Pemberton over the years. Birthday cards, business correspondence, the occasional handwritten follow-up after a meeting. They recognized the handwriting before Theodore said a word. A man in the second row pressed his fist briefly to his mouth. 2 women near the back reached for each other's hands. Theodore unfolded the letter. His hands were steady. He cleared his throat once for the acoustics. And in the silence of that St. Regis ballroom, he began to read. "Theodore, my son, if you are reading this aloud in front of people, it means she made the choice I feared she would make. I'm sorry. For what it cost you, and for what it says about failures of my own in raising a child who could make it." No one moved. I built Pemberton systems across 30 years with the belief that the patents, the work, the reputation, none of it meant anything if it passed to someone who would consume it rather than steward it. I nearly lost it once. You saved it. Not because you had to. Not because anyone asked you. You saved it because you are the kind of man who finishes things. Theodore's jaw held. His voice held. I watched you for 9 years, son. I watched you show up. I watched you sit beside me in that hospital without needing to be asked. I watched you do the work that doesn't get noticed, and I watched you do it again the next day without mentioning it. I have known a few men like you in my life. Not many. He glanced up briefly at the older men near the back of the room. Several of them were nodding. One had his head bowed. I could not leave this legacy to be dissolved. Real love doesn't make space for that. Real love prevents it. The Hayes name, He paused over the word, then corrected in real time. The Pemberton name was built to endure, not to be converted into jewelry and private accounts by people who confuse inheritance with achievement. He folded the letter once. You are the right steward. You always have been. I am proud of you. Take care of what we built. He folded it again. Arthur Pemberton. The room held for 4 full seconds. Then Felicia moved. She had held her posture through the entire reading, chin level, champagne flute in both hands, every line of her body performing composure. And then her father's words were folded away. And something in her that had been held by performance alone gave way completely. She moved forward with both hands reaching for the letter the way you reach for something you cannot have back. Her heel caught the edge of the carpet runner at the base of the table. She went down, one knee first, then both, the champagne flute leaving her grip and exploding against the marble in a bright spray of glass. Her grandmother's pearls swung forward on their chain. She caught herself on both palms, and she was kneeling on the ballroom floor of the St. Regis Houston, and the sound that came from her had no performance left in it at all. It was grief, unmanaged, undesigned grief, the kind that does not remember it has an audience because it is too large to care about anything that small. The kind that arrives when the last story you have been telling yourself about who you are finally collapses under the weight of what is actually true. Across the room, Philip Moss had been moving slowly toward the service corridor. He was approximately 8 feet from the door when 2 security officers, arranged by Constance that afternoon, because Constance arranged everything, stepped forward and filled the frame. "Mr. Moss," said the taller one, "please stay where you are." Philip stopped. He looked at Constance. Constance looked back at him with the composed, entirely unsurprised expression of someone who had built this exact moment into the plan 11 months ago. He stayed. A hotel staff member helped Felicia to her feet. She was past the point of managing herself. Her hair had come loose. Her makeup was gone. She looked across the room at Theodore, and she was searching his face for what people always search for when they have lost badly: anger, satisfaction, the cold pleasure of being right. She did not find any of those things. What she found was the thing that was harder to carry than all of them: sorrow, plain and genuine and long-worn. The sorrow of a man who had loved his wife faithfully for 11 years, had watched her choose poorly across 14 months, and had not enjoyed a single moment of being right about where it was heading. "You planned all of this," she said. Her voice was stripped of everything practiced. "No," Theodore said gently. "I prepared for it." "Those are 2 different things." He held the folded letter for a moment. Then he returned it to his jacket pocket, over his heart, where it had been for 14 months. "I didn't do this for revenge, Felicia," he said. "Your father asked me to protect what he built. That's all I did." He looked at her one final time. The long, honest look of a farewell already made in private. Then he nodded at Constance. She was already on her phone. The courts moved efficiently, the way courts do when the documentation is clean and the opposing argument is structurally absent. Constance filed the civil fraud complaint the Monday morning following the party. The forensic audit had been in final form for 3 weeks. 26 exhibit folders, cross-referenced and notarized, containing bank records, wire transfer confirmations, and internal Pemberton Systems accounting data going back 30 months. $2.2 million moved in careful increments deliberately sized to remain beneath standard audit detection thresholds. Patient work, precise work, not quite precise enough. The court issued its judgment 7 weeks later. Felicia Wynne and Philip Moss were ordered to repay the full $2.2 million plus statutory penalties, interest, and legal costs. Non-compliance would trigger criminal prosecution. There was no viable appeal. Philip retained a defense attorney the morning after the party, and by all accounts did not sleep well for a month. His financial consulting practice did not survive the proceedings. 3 former clients, emboldened by the public nature of the case, filed complaints that had been sitting dormant for years, He settled 2 of them quietly and fought the third and lost both ways. Felicia paid. It required selling things: the luxury SUV purchased the month after the funeral, the wardrobe assembled on the Pemberton corporate account, several pieces of jewelry. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Sugarland, a clean building, a reasonable neighborhood. Nothing wrong with it by any ordinary standard. The kind of place she would have described 14 months earlier as beneath her. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday afternoon in Constance's conference room. Theodore signed the papers with a plain pen, the same kind he used for work contracts. He set the pen down. He looked across the table at Constance. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him over her glasses, steady as always. "You built the case," she said. "I filed it." He nodded. "Still," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. For Constance Webb, what followed, the slight softening at the corners of her expression, was the professional equivalent of a standing ovation. 6 weeks after the judgment, Felicia's attorney paused during a routine procedural call and said, carefully, that his client had a personal question, off the record. Felicia had seen a photograph. Someone who had attended the event had posted a candid shot taken outside the St. Regis that evening, not with any harmful intent, simply the way people record moments that feel significant. In the image, Theodore was standing near the Escalade, composed, phone in hand, and visible through the rear passenger window, clearly in frame, was a woman sitting quietly with a book in her lap, short natural hair, reading glasses, the particular stillness of a person who is entirely comfortable with where they are. Felicia's question, relayed carefully through her attorney, was, "Who is she?" Her name was Naomi Solis, 41 years old, a licensed clinical social worker who ran a private practice in Midtown Houston and consulted 2 days a week at a children's advocacy center in the 5th Ward. She had a directness that took some people by surprise and that Theodore had found, from their first conversation, entirely refreshing. They had met 5 years earlier at a fundraising event for the advocacy center. Arthur had sent Pemberton Systems materials to sponsor a renovation of the center's family meeting rooms, and Theodore had shown up personally to oversee the installation because that was how he operated. Naomi had been facilitating a family session in the adjacent room and had come out to the corridor during a break and found Theodore on his knees, studying a baseplate alignment with the focused attention of someone who cared about getting it right. She had brought the crew water. She and Theodore had talked for 12 minutes about acoustics, about what it meant to design a space where frightened people were supposed to feel safe. She had walked back to her session, thinking, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years studying human behavior, that man knows exactly who he is. She had held that observation carefully for 5 years. 8 months ago, Theodore had called her. It was a Tuesday evening. She was writing session notes at her desk. He said, "I don't know if you remember me," she said. "I remember you." They had been together since then, with the unhurried honesty of 2 people who had both long since learned the difference between a relationship and a performance. Theodore's response to Felicia's question was delivered formally through Constance's office. "Naomi Solis is my partner. We plan to marry in the spring." No further context was provided. None was needed. Felicia read the response in her Sugarland apartment, sitting at a second-hand kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She read it twice. Then she set it down and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the parking lot below, at the ordinary Saturday morning traffic of a neighborhood she had never imagined herself living in. She thought about something her father had said to her once, when she was in her 20s, and had dismissed a colleague at a company dinner without meaning to be unkind. "Baby," Arthur had said on the drive home, his voice even and careful. "The ones who don't need the room's attention are the ones worth paying attention to." She had not paid attention, and now she was paying a different kind. The morning light in Houston comes in sideways and gold in early autumn. Unhurried light. The kind that does not announce itself. Theodore was on the back porch of the Bel Air house at 6:40 in the morning, in a clean t-shirt and old jeans, holding a cup of coffee from the French press. Naomi had brought over 2 months ago and positioned on the counter with the quiet authority of someone who intends to stay. In his other hand was his father's Zippo lighter. He turned it over twice, the familiar weight of it grounding him the way it always did. A mechanism that kept doing its one job regardless of everything happening around it. He looked at the backyard, the live oak that had dropped a major limb in the last August storm, and that he had been meaning to have assessed. The garden bed along the south fence, that Naomi had asked about twice with the kind of casual interest that meant she was already picturing what she might plant there. He thought about his father. He thought about Arthur. He thought about what it costs a man to give himself to the people and the work he loves without keeping a ledger. How it is enough. How it has always been enough, even when no one is watching. He said it softly, to the yard and to the morning, and to whoever could hear it from wherever they were. I kept my word, he said. The back door opened. He heard her before he saw her, the unhurried sound of bare feet on the porch boards. Then Naomi Solis slipped her arms around him from behind, her chin at his shoulder, and they stood together in the early quiet, watching the live oak move slightly in the morning air. She said, after a while, "The guest room still has no furniture, I know, and the downstairs bathroom faucet is dripping. I know that too." She pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder. Then, "Your mother has texted 4 times about the ceremony flowers. I want you to know I love her, and I also want you to know she has mentioned dahlias in every single message." Theodore laughed, a full, real laugh, the kind that had been scarcer for 14 months and was now, unmistakably, coming back. "Tell her she can have every dahlia in Houston," he said. Naomi reached past him and handed him a second mug. She had brought 2. She always brought 2. "Are you all right?" she asked, not with worry, with the direct, honest care of someone who wanted a true answer. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, completely and without hurry. "Yes," he said, "I genuinely am." And he was. Not the practiced okay of a man pushing through something difficult, actual peace. The clean, settled stillness of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time, set it down with care, and walked away without looking back. Dorothy Wynne arrived at noon. She carried a covered dish, sweet potato pie, the one with the brown sugar crust that Theodore had been requesting since he was 7 years old. She was wearing her good church clothes and the expression of a woman who had been right about everything for a very long time, and was far too gracious to say so directly. She set the dish on the kitchen counter, looked around the house that her son now owned outright, the house his wife had stacked his boxes outside of on a September Thursday in the early dark, and was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to where Theodore was standing, put both hands on his face, and held him there. "I am proud of you," she said. "You told me that already," he said. "I will keep telling you until it is all the way in," she said. She released him. She looked past him at Naomi, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a warm, unguarded expression. "Now," Dorothy said, "that guest room has no furniture. That is not how we do things." She pointed at Naomi. "You and I are handling that this afternoon." Naomi laughed, a full, easy laugh that filled the kitchen. Dorothy winked at her. The dahlia negotiations began within the hour. Later, while Dorothy and Naomi worked through logistics with the cheerful focus of 2 women who had recognized each other as the same kind of person, Theodore stood at the back porch railing, lighter in hand, the live oak moving slowly in the late afternoon air. He allowed himself for a moment to think about Felicia, not with bitterness, not with the cold satisfaction of someone who has won, but with the quiet, long-worn grief of a man who loved someone for 11 years and watched that person choose poorly until there was nothing left to choose. He did not wish her hardship. He simply understood, with the full settled weight of a man who had nothing left to prove, what was true. She had held something rare and mistaken its stillness for emptiness. She had looked at a man building something in the quiet background of her life and seen only a man who wasn't loud enough to be worth keeping. He tucked the lighter back into his pocket, went inside, and joined his family. There are three things worth taking from this story, not as abstract wisdom, but as practical knowledge you can use. The first, before you assume an inheritance is simple, sit down with an independent attorney, someone you chose, not the family's, and read every document in the estate. Felicia received $38 million and never once asked what was actually inside the paperwork. That is a mistake that has a very specific and preventable cost. The second, the people in your life who show up without being asked, who fix the broken thing before you notice it's broken, who call on a Wednesday for no reason. Those people are worth more than you are probably acknowledging. Theodore spent 11 years being that person, and it was invisible until the moment it wasn't. Don't let that be your relationship with someone you love. The third, greed is quiet at first. It starts small and explains itself reasonably, and by the time it becomes visible, it has already done most of the damage. Trust what you notice early. Arthur Pemberton noticed. He just wished he had acted sooner. Don't wait.